Picture a grand English manor, St. Mary's Grange, aglow with Christmas cheer, until a single bite of pudding turns deadly. Dr. Lionel Hurst collapses, poisoned by cyanide, and the festive table becomes a crime scene. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind. As secrets unravel, family scandals, hidden debts, and a businessman's dark dealings, she zeroes in on a tarnished spoon that holds the key to murder. In this chilling Agatha Christie-style mystery, no one is above suspicion, and the truth lies in the smallest details. Can Miss Marple untangle the web before the killer strikes again? Chapter 1. The Invitation to St. Mary's Grange. The winter sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a pale glow through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. A faint chill seeped past the windows, despite the crackling fire in the hearth. Miss Marple, her white hair neatly pinned and her frail figure wrapped in a woolen shawl, sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. A half-finished scarf, destined for a distant nephew, lay across her lap. The village was quiet, as it often was in the days before Christmas, but Miss Marple's mind was alert, attuned to the subtle undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of even the most tranquil places. On the table beside her rested a letter, its envelope bearing the crest of St. Mary's Grange. It had arrived that morning, delivered by a rosy-cheeked postman who had lingered to exchange pleasantries about the frosty weather. The letter was from Mrs. Dolly Bantry, an old friend whose exuberance was as predictable as her husband's reticence. The invitation was to spend Christmas at the Grange, a sprawling Georgian estate some miles from St. Mary Mead. "Do come, Jane," Dolly had written in her sprawling hand. "Arthur insists, and we've gathered a few interesting guests. It will be such fun." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Dolly's interesting guests often proved to be more than they seemed, and her invitations had a way of leading to unexpected complications. The journey to the Grange was brisk, the taxi winding through lanes bordered by snow-dusted hedgerows. Miss Marple, clutching her small, sensible suitcase, stepped out into the crisp air of Christmas Eve. The Grange loomed before her, its windows aglow with warm light, the scent of pine and wood smoke drifting from the chimneys. Dolly Bantry greeted her at the door, her round face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you're here! Oh, it's going to be splendid!" she exclaimed, ushering her inside. Colonel Arthur Bantry, red-faced and hearty, offered a gruff welcome and a glass of sherry, which Miss Marple accepted with a polite nod. The drawing-room was a picture of festive cheer, with holly garlands draped over the mantel and a towering Christmas tree adorned with glass baubles. The other guests, already assembled, turned to greet the newcomer. Sir Henry Clithering, retired Scotland Yard Commissioner, gave Miss Marple a warm smile, his keen eyes betraying a shared understanding of human nature's darker corners. Dr. Lionel Hurst, a London physician with a booming voice and an air of self-importance, extended a perfunctory handshake. Mrs. Cecilia Travers, a striking widow in her 40s, glittered with diamonds and an almost theatrical charm. Her stepson, Roger Travers, a lean young man with shadowed eyes, offered a curt nod, his attention elsewhere. Miss Violet Henshaw, a local spinster with a pinched face and a penchant for village gossip, clutched a notebook, no doubt filled with notes for her historical tome. Finally, Mr. Percy Vale, a portly businessman with a too loud laugh, raised his glass in a jovial toast, though his eyes darted nervously about the room. Dinner was announced with a gong, and the party moved to the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under candlelight. The meal progressed through courses of consommé, roast pheasant, and glazed vegetables, each dish accompanied by Dolly's cheerful commentary. Miss Marple, seated between Sir Henry and Miss Henshaw, listened more than she spoke, her mild gaze taking in the interplay of glances and half-spoken remarks. Cecilia Travers dominated the conversation, her laughter bright but brittle, while Roger sat in moody silence. Dr. Hurst expounded on medical advancements, oblivious to Miss Henshaw's thinly veiled disdain. Percy Vale, meanwhile, seemed overly attentive to the Colonel's vintage port, refilling his glass with a frequency that Miss Marple noted. The evening's climax came with the arrival of the Christmas pudding, carried in by the butler with due ceremony. The lights were dimmed, and a blue flame danced over the brandy-soaked dessert, drawing gasps of delight. Portions were served, and the room filled with the rich scent of raisins and spice. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked discreetly beside her, took a small bite, savouring the tradition. But the festive mood shattered when Dr. Hurst, seated across from her, let out a strangled cry. His face contorted, his hands clawed at his throat, and he slumped forward, his head striking the table with a sickening thud. His pudding, half eaten, spilled across the cloth. A stunned silence followed, broken only by Cecilia Travers's sharp scream. Colonel Bantry leapt to his feet, barking orders to the staff, while Dolly clutched Miss Marple's arm. Sir Henry, calm amid the chaos, checked Hurst's pulse and shook his head grimly. "He's gone," he said quietly. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the scene. The pudding, she thought, or something in it, but why only Hurst? The answer, she knew, lay in the tangled web of motives and opportunities now unfolding before her. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Pudding. The dining room at St. Mary's Grange, so recently a stage for festive cheer, had transformed into a tableau of shock and suspicion. The flickering candles cast long shadows across the mahogany table where Dr. Lionel Hurst's body lay slumped, his face an ashen mask of agony. The remnants of his Christmas pudding, a dark, glistening mound, sat accusingly beside him. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table, her knitting idle in her lap, observed the scene with her characteristic calm. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their mild facade, took in every detail: the overturned glass, the scattered crumbs, the horrified faces of the guests frozen in the aftermath of the tragedy. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her hands trembling, was the first to break the silence. "Oh, Arthur, do something!" she cried, turning to her husband. Colonel Bantry, his ruddy complexion drained, barked for the butler to fetch the village doctor. The other guests, released from their initial paralysis, erupted into a clamour of voices. Mrs. Cecilia Travers, her diamonds catching the candlelight, pressed a hand to her throat, her voice trembling as she murmured, "How dreadful!" Her stepson, Roger Travers, stared at the body, his dark eyes unreadable. Miss Violet Henshaw, clutching her ever-present notebook, muttered something about a scandal for the ages. Mr. Percy Vale, his jovial demeanour shattered, mopped his brow with a handkerchief, stammering, I ate the same pudding, didn't I? I feel perfectly fine." Sir Henry Clithering, the retired Scotland Yard Commissioner, remained composed, his gaze meeting Miss Marple's for a brief, meaningful moment. The village doctor, Dr. Meadows, arrived within the hour, his coat dusted with snow. A wiry man with a perpetually harried air, he confirmed what Sir Henry had already suspected. Dr. Hurst was dead, and the cause was almost certainly poison. "Cyanide, I'd wager," Meadows said, sniffing the air near the body. "There's a faint almond-like odour. We'll need a proper autopsy, but I've seen enough cases to know." The word poison hung in the air like a spectre, silencing the room once more. Inspector Crane, the local police officer, arrived shortly after, his young face set with determination, but betraying the strain of a case far beyond the usual village misdemeanours. Inspector Crane, a tall man with a clipped moustache and an earnest demeanour, took charge with a brisk efficiency that Miss Marple found commendable, if somewhat overzealous. He herded the guests into the drawing room, where the Christmas tree's baubles seemed to mock the grim mood. The dining room was sealed off, and the staff were instructed to preserve everything exactly as it was. Crane began his interrogations, his notebook open and his pencil poised. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, listened intently, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. The questioning revealed little at first. The Christmas pudding had been prepared by Mrs. Bates, the Grange's cook, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air who swore she had followed her usual recipe. "Same as every year, sir," she said, her hands twisting her apron. "Raisins, suet, brandy, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd stake my life on it." The pudding had been made days earlier, stored in the pantry, and steamed that afternoon before being brought to the table. The brandy sauce, poured and ignited for the traditional flourish, had come from a single jug, and all the guests had partaken, yet only Dr. Hurst had collapsed. Inspector Crane pressed further. "Who served the pudding?" he demanded. The butler, Mr. Grayson, a dignified man in his 50s, stepped forward. "I did, sir," he said. "I carried the pudding in, and the footman James cut and served the portions." James, a nervous lad barely out of his teens, nodded vigorously. "I cut it fair, sir, and passed the plates round. Everyone got the same." Crane's eyes narrowed. "And no one tampered with Dr. Hurst's portion?" Both men shook their heads emphatically, but Miss Marple noted a slight hesitation in James's manner, a fleeting glance toward the door. The guests were questioned next. Mrs. Cecilia Travers, her voice tremulous but her posture regal, insisted she had been too engrossed in conversation to notice anything amiss. "I was speaking with Colonel Bantry about the hunt," she said, her eyes wide. "I didn't even see the pudding until it was on my plate." Roger Travers, her stepson, was less forthcoming, his answers clipped. "I was eating, same as everyone else. Didn't see a thing." Miss Henshaw, her sharp tongue undimmed, suggested a kitchen error. "These things happen with careless staff," she said, earning a glare from Mrs. Bates. Percy Vale, still sweating despite the chilly room, repeated his earlier claim. "I had a second helping, Inspector. If there was poison, wouldn't I be dead too?" Sir Henry, when questioned, offered only that he had been watching the pudding's dramatic entrance, distracted by the flames. Miss Marple, though not directly questioned, absorbed every word. She noted the undercurrents of tension, Cecilia's practiced poise, Roger's sullen restraint, Miss Henshaw's eagerness to cast blame, and Vale's nervous insistence on his own safety. The cyanide, she reasoned, must have been administered with precision, affecting only Hurst. But how? The pudding had come from a single dish, and the sauce from a shared jug. The poison could not have been in the dish itself, or more would have fallen ill. Her mind turned to the moment the lights had dimmed for the pudding's entrance. The room bathed in the eerie glow of the brandy flames. A clever hand, she thought, could have seized that moment. As the interrogations concluded, Inspector Crane announced that no one was to leave the Grange until further notice. The guests dispersed, murmuring among themselves, while Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room. Dolly Bantry, wringing her hands, approached her. "Jane, isn't it awful? Poison in our pudding. What will people say?" Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. There, Dolly. The truth will come out. It always does." But her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the details like a gardener turning soil. She requested to see the dining room again, and Colonel Bantry, eager to assist, escorted her. The table remained untouched, a grim, still life. Hurst's plate, with its half-eaten pudding, was cordoned off by Crane's orders. Miss Marple's eyes roamed over the scene. The silver cutlery, the crystal glasses, the crumpled napkin beside Hurst's chair. She paused at the dessert spoon, its handle slightly askew. Was this Dr. Hurst's spoon? She asked Grayson, who had followed them. Yes, miss, he replied. Each place was set with its own. She nodded, her fingers brushing the spoon's handle. It was polished to a gleam, yet something about it struck her as odd. She filed the observation away, her mind already turning to the guests' motives. That night, as the Grange settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the snow-covered lawns. Her knitting lay untouched, her thoughts weaving a different pattern. Cyanide was a swift and merciless poison, requiring both access and intent. Whoever had poisoned Dr. Hurst had planned the act with care, exploiting the chaos of the pudding's presentation. But why Hurst? He was a newcomer to the Grange, a man whose arrogance had been evident even in the brief hours Miss Marple had observed him. Had he crossed someone in the room? Or was his death a means to an end, a distraction from a larger scheme? She recalled the guests' interactions at dinner. Cecilia Travers had laughed too brightly, her charm a carefully constructed mask. Roger, her stepson, had barely spoken, his eyes fixed on his plate or, occasionally, on Cecilia, with a look that bordered on contempt. Miss Henshaw's sharp remarks had hinted at knowledge she was eager to share, while Percy Vale's joviality had seemed forced, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass. Sir Henry, ever the observer, had watched them all, much as Miss Marple had, but even he, with his years at Scotland Yard, had missed the moment the poison was administered. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household itself. The staff, though shaken, had been loyal to the Bantrys for years. Mrs. Bates, the cook, had been indignant at the suggestion of negligence, and Grayson, the butler, carried himself with the dignity of long service. James, the young footman, was less certain, his nervousness suggesting inexperience rather than guilt. Yet Miss Marple knew that in a house like the Grange, secrets could hide in the most unexpected corners. She considered the nature of cyanide. It was not a poison one stumbled upon by accident. It required access, perhaps from a laboratory, a pharmacy, or an industrial source. Dr. Hurst, as a physician, might have had such access. But why would he poison himself? No. The poison had come from another hand, one familiar with its properties. Miss Marple's mind flitted to the guests' backgrounds, though she knew little of them yet. Cecilia Travers, with her wealth and glamour, might have connections to unsavoury circles. Roger, with his brooding demeanour, could be hiding debts or grudges. Miss Henshaw, with her obsession for local history, might have uncovered a secret worth killing for. And Percy Vale, his nervous laughter and quick defence suggested a man with something to conceal. As the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple rose and lit a small candle, its flame steady in the still room. She opened her notebook, not unlike Miss Henshaw's, though far less ostentatious, and jotted down her observations. The poison, the spoon, the dimmed lights, the guests' reactions. Each was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet see. But she knew, with the quiet certainty that had solved many a village mystery, that the truth lay in the details. Somewhere, in the flicker of a glance or the slip of a word, the murderer had betrayed themselves. It was only a matter of time before Miss Marple found it. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, and Miss Marple extinguished her candle. She would need her rest, for tomorrow would bring new revelations. As she slipped into bed, her mind lingered on one thought. The Christmas pudding, so innocent in its festive glory, had become a weapon. But it was not the pudding itself she suspected. It was the hand that had turned it deadly. Chapter 3. The Shadows of Motive. The morning after Dr. Hurst's death dawned cold and grey, the sky over St. Mary's Grange heavy with the promise of more snow. Inside, the festive decorations seemed out of place, the holly garlands and twinkling lights a mockery of the grim atmosphere. Miss Jane Marple, having slept lightly but well, descended to the breakfast room with her usual composure. Her simple black dress and neatly pinned white hair gave her an air of unobtrusive respectability, but her mind was as sharp as the frost outside, piecing together the fragments of the previous night's tragedy. The breakfast table was sparsely attended. Colonel Bantry, his face etched with worry, picked at his kedgeree, while Dolly Bantry, ever the hostess, attempted to keep up a stream of nervous chatter. Sir Henry Clithering, seated opposite Miss Marple, offered her a nod, his eyes betraying a flicker of amusement at her quiet presence. The other guests were slower to appear. Mrs. Cecilia Travers entered in a cloud of perfume, her silk dressing gown a touch too elegant for the hour. Roger Travers followed, his expression as sullen as ever, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. Miss Violet Henshaw, clutching her notebook like a talisman, took a seat near the window, her sharp eyes darting between her fellow guests. Percy Vale, looking haggard, arrived last, muttering apologies about a sleepless night. The meal was a subdued affair, the clink of cutlery and the occasional cough punctuating Dolly's forced pleasantries. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the dynamics with care. Cecilia's charm seemed strained, her smiles directed more at Colonel Bantry than at her stepson, who ignored her entirely. Roger's silence was heavy, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if it held the answers to his troubles. Miss Henshaw scribbled something in her notebook, her lips pursed in disapproval, while Percy Vale's hands trembled as he buttered his toast. Sir Henry, catching Miss Marple's eye, raised an eyebrow as if to say, "What a curious lot." Inspector Crane arrived mid-morning, his boots leaving damp prints on the polished floor. He gathered the household in the drawing room, where the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled. "We've had the preliminary report from the autopsy," he announced, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Dr. Hurst died of cyanide poisoning, as suspected. The poison was likely ingested with his pudding, though we're still analysing the dish itself. I'll need to speak with each of you again, and I expect full cooperation. His tone left no room for argument, though Miss Marple noted a slight quiver in his jaw, a sign of the pressure he felt. The questioning began with Cecilia Travers. She sat elegantly, her hands folded in her lap, her diamond earrings catching the light. "I've told you everything, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I was speaking with Colonel Bantry when the pudding was served. I didn't notice anything unusual." Crane pressed her on her relationship with Dr. Hurst. "You'd met him before, hadn't you?" Cecilia's smile tightened. "Once or twice at social gatherings in London. He was a colleague of my late husband's, but we were hardly close." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, a momentary lapse in her polished facade. Roger Travers was next, his answers curt and defensive. "I didn't know Hurst," he said, his voice low. "He was my stepmother's acquaintance, not mine. I was eating my pudding, same as everyone else." When Crane asked about his financial situation, Roger's jaw clenched. "I've had some debts, yes. Who hasn't? But I didn't poison anyone." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted his hands, balled into fists, and the way his eyes darted towards Cecilia. There was resentment there, deep and unspoken. Miss Violet Henshaw, when called, was eager to speak, her words laced with a relish that bordered on malice. "I've been researching the Travers family for my book," she said, tapping her notebook. "There's quite a history there, Inspector. Cecilia's first husband, Mr. Edmund Travers, was a chemist, you know. There were rumours about his death. Some said it wasn't natural." She paused for effect, her eyes gleaming. "Dr. Hurst was interested in that case. He wrote about it in some medical journal, hinting at foul play. Perhaps he knew too much." Cecilia, overhearing, gave a sharp laugh, but Miss Marple saw her fingers tighten around her handkerchief. Percy Vale's interrogation was marked by nervous bluster. "I barely knew Hurst," he insisted, his face flushed. Met him once at a conference in Birmingham. I'm a businessman, Inspector, not a chemist. I wouldn't know cyanide from sugar syrup. His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool room. Crane, unimpressed, asked about Vale's business. Chemicals, mostly, Vale admitted. We supply laboratories, factories, that sort of thing. He waved a hand dismissively, but Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail. Chemicals. Could Vale have had access to cyanide? Sir Henry Clithering, questioned last, was concise. I was watching the pudding's entrance, Inspector. A fine spectacle, but I saw nothing suspicious. Hurst was an abrasive man, I'll grant you. He had enemies in London, professional rivals mostly, but I've no idea who'd want him dead here. His tone was measured, but Miss Marple sensed he was holding back, perhaps out of loyalty to the Bantries or a desire to observe more before speaking. As the interrogations ended, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, a quiet room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy drapes. She needed solitude to think. Settling into a chair, her knitting in her lap, she let her mind wander over the morning's revelations. The cyanide, she reasoned, had been targeted at Hurst alone, a fact that suggested both motive and opportunity. The dimming of the lights during the pudding's presentation had created a moment of distraction, but the poison's delivery remained a puzzle. Had it been in the pudding itself, or something else? The shared dish and sauce made a contaminated portion unlikely, unless the poison had been added after serving. Her thoughts turned to the guests' motives. Cecilia Travers, with her poised exterior, might have feared Hurst's knowledge of her late husband's death. Miss Henshaw's insinuations about Edmund Travers suggested a scandal that Hurst could have revived, threatening Cecilia's reputation or fortune. Roger, with his debts and evident dislike for his stepmother, might have seen Hurst as a pawn in a larger game, though Miss Marple doubted his subtlety for such a precise crime. Miss Henshaw herself, with her penchant for secrets, could have had her own reasons, perhaps a grudge against Hurst for his academic meddling. Percy Vale's nervousness and connection to chemicals were troubling, hinting at a man with both means and something to hide. Miss Marple's mind drifted to her own village, St. Mary Mead, where motives often hid behind polite smiles. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, who had poisoned a rival's tea at a church fete out of jealousy, a crude act, but not unlike this one in its calculation. The key, she knew, was in the details. A glance, a gesture, a word out of place. She thought back to the dinner, replaying the scene in her mind. The butler, Grayson, had carried the pudding with pride. The footman, James, cutting portions with nervous precision. Cecilia had laughed. Roger had scowled. Vale had drunk too much, and Miss Henshaw had watched them all like a hawk. Hurst himself had been loud, his voice grating as he lectured on some medical theory. Had he said something to provoke his killer? She was interrupted by Dolly Bantry, who burst into the library, her face flushed. "Jane, it's too awful. The servants are whispering, and Cecilia's threatening to leave, though the inspector won't allow it. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's early days, Dolly. People reveal themselves in time, you know." Dolly sighed, sinking into a chair. "I thought it would be a Merry Christmas, but now, poison, in our pudding." Miss Marple patted her hand. "The pudding may be innocent yet. We must look beyond it." As Dolly chattered on, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the dining room. The spoon beside Hurst's plate lingered in her memory. Its handle had caught her eye, though she couldn't yet say why. She resolved to examine it again, if Crane would allow it. Rising, she excused herself and made her way to the dining room, where a constable stood guard. With her most disarming smile, she asked to see the table, just to settle my nerves. The young man, flustered, allowed her a brief look. The table was as it had been, a frozen moment of chaos. Hurst's plate, the spilled pudding, the glass of port, all untouched. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the spoon. It was silver, like the others, but its sheen seemed slightly dulled, as if it had been handled differently. She leaned closer, careful not to touch. A faint discoloration marked the handle, barely visible. "Curious," she murmured. The constable, watching her, frowned. "Something wrong, miss?" She shook her head, her mind racing. The spoon could be the key, she thought. If the cyanide had been applied to it, rather than the pudding, it would explain why only Hurst was affected. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Sir Henry alone, studying a chessboard. "You've been thinking, haven't you, Miss Marple?" he said, his tone warm but probing. She smiled faintly. "I find it hard not to, Sir Henry. People are so very like one another, wherever you go." He chuckled. "You're on to something, I'll wager. Care to share?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But I wonder, did you notice anything odd about the cutlery last night?" Sir Henry's eyes sharpened. "Can't say I did, but I'll keep it in mind." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. She would need more before she spoke, but the threads were beginning to form a pattern. As the day drew on, the Grange remained a house under siege, its guests trapped by suspicion and snow. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, let her thoughts weave through the tangle of motives. The spoon, the cyanide, the dimmed lights, all pointed to a careful hand. But whose? The answer, she knew, was close, hidden in the shadows of the Grange's festive facade. Chapter 4. A glimpse of the past. The snow fell steadily outside St. Mary's Grange, cloaking the estate in a silent white shroud that seemed to mirror the tension within. By mid-morning, the household was restless. The guests confined by Inspector Crane's orders and their own unspoken suspicions. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, appeared as serene as ever, her needles moving with a steady rhythm. Yet her mind was far from idle, turning over the threads of the previous night's tragedy, the poisoned spoon, the calculated delivery of cyanide, and the web of motives among the guests formed a puzzle that was beginning to take shape, though its edges remained elusive. The morning room, with its chintz curtains and polished oak table, was a haven of calm amidst the storm. Dolly Bantry, ever anxious to keep her guests occupied, had arranged for tea and scones, though few had an appetite. Colonel Bantry stood by the window, staring out at the snow, his usual bluster subdued. Sir Henry Clithering, flipping through a newspaper without reading it, occasionally glanced at Miss Marple, as if expecting her to produce a solution from her knitting bag. The other guests were scattered. Cecilia Travers had retired to her room, citing a headache. Roger Travers paced the hall, his footsteps echoing. Miss Violet Henshaw scribbled furiously in her notebook, and Percy Vale, pale and fidgety, hovered near the fire, nursing a brandy despite the early hour. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity to gather more pieces of the puzzle, decided to take a walk with Dolly. "Fresh air will do us good," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Dolly, eager for distraction, agreed, and the two women bundled into coats and scarves, stepping out into the snow-dusted gardens. The paths were slick, the air sharp with cold, but Miss Marple's step was steady, her eyes bright as she took in the frost-covered rose bushes and the distant outline of the Grange's stables. As they walked, Dolly's nervous chatter flowed freely. "It's dreadful, Jane. Simply dreadful," she said, her breath visible in the chill air. "Poison at our table. I keep thinking of poor Dr. Hurst, so full of himself one moment, and gone the next. And the guests. Cecilia's been so odd, don't you think? All that charm, but I swear she's hiding something. And Roger, such a moody boy. Did you know his stepmother controls his inheritance? Arthur says it's caused no end of trouble." Miss Marple nodded. encouraging Dolly to continue. "And that Miss Henshaw," Dolly went on, lowering her voice, "always poking into other people's affairs. She's writing some book about local families, and I heard her mention the Traverses. Something about Cecilia's first husband, Edmund. There were rumours, you know, when he died. Not that I believe gossip, but—" Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "Rumours?" she asked, her tone mild but curious. Dolly hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, it's not my place to say, but they say Edmund Travers died suddenly. Heart failure, officially, but some whispered it was poison. He was a chemist, you know, always mixing things in his laboratory. Cecilia inherited everything, and Roger was left with nothing until she passes. It's no wonder he's so resentful." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to Cecilia's poised demeanour and Roger's sullen glances. A disputed inheritance and a questionable death. Motive enough for murder, perhaps. But how did Hurst fit in? Returning to the Grange, Miss Marple sought out Miss Violet Henshaw, who was in the library, surrounded by stacks of old parish records. The spinster's eyes gleamed with the fervour of a scholar unearthing treasure. "Miss Marple," she said, looking up from her notes, "I suppose you're here to pry, like everyone else." Her tone was sharp, but Miss Marple's smile disarmed her. "Not at all, Miss Henshaw. I merely thought you might share a little of your expertise. Your book sounds fascinating." Flattered, Miss Henshaw warmed to the subject. "It's a history of the county's great families," she said, "and the Traverses are a particularly intriguing case. Edmund Travers, Cecilia's first husband, was a brilliant chemist, but there were whispers he used his knowledge for unsavoury purposes. A rival of his, another chemist, died under odd circumstances, and Edmund was suspected, though nothing was proven. Dr. Hurst, you see, wrote about it years later in a medical journal, suggesting poison. I found the article in my research. Quite damning, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And you think Dr. Hurst's interest in the case might have troubled Mrs. Travers?" Miss Henshaw's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I'd say so. Cecilia's built her life on that fortune, and Hurst's meddling could have stirred up old scandals. Not to mention her stepson, Roger. He'd love to see her disgraced. He's in debt up to his ears, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Hurst's knowledge of Cecilia's past could indeed have made him a threat, but was Cecilia the type to poison a man in so public a setting? Or was Roger, with his simmering anger, capable of such a bold act? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple joined Sir Henry in the drawing-room, where he was studying a map of the estate, perhaps to distract himself from the oppressive atmosphere. "You're deep in thought, Miss Marple," he said, his tone light but probing. "Care to share what's caught your fancy?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Only that people are so predictable, Sir Henry. A man like Dr. Hurst, arrogant, opinionated, must have made enemies. I wonder if he crossed someone here, perhaps unknowingly." Sir Henry leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Hurst was a thorn in many sides. In London, he clashed with colleagues over medical ethics, even accused one of falsifying research. But here, I'd say Cecilia or Roger have the strongest reasons to want him gone, given what Violet's been digging up. And Vale, well, he's a bundle of nerves, isn't he? Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to Percy Vale. His connection to chemicals was too convenient to ignore, and his nervous demeanour suggested guilt, or at least fear. She recalled his quick defence at the questioning, his insistence that he'd eaten the same pudding. Yet his hands had trembled, his laughter forced. Was he hiding a professional grudge against Hurst, or something more personal? That evening, as the guests gathered for a strained dinner, minus the pudding at Dolly's insistence, Miss Marple observed a heated exchange between Cecilia and Roger. They stood in a corner of the drawing-room, their voices low but intense. "You'd do well to mind your own affairs." Cecilia hissed, her face pale. Roger's reply was inaudible, but his clenched fists and narrowed eyes spoke volumes. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her shawl, noted the exchange. A family rift, fueled by money and secrets, could easily lead to violence, but the precision of Hurst's murder suggested a cooler head. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room, her notebook open on the bedside table. By candlelight, she jotted down her thoughts. Cecilia's past, Roger's debts, Miss Henshaw's insinuations, Vale's nervousness. The spoon, with its faint discoloration, remained a focal point. She suspected the cyanide had been applied to it, not the pudding, a method requiring both access and a moment of distraction. The dimmed lights during the pudding's entrance provided the perfect cover. But who had been near Hurst's place setting? Grayson, the butler, had been busy with the presentation, and James, the footman, had served the portions. Could one of them have been involved? Or was it a guest, slipping the poison onto the spoon in the fleeting darkness? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her own village, where small acts of malice often revealed larger truths. She remembered Mrs. Price, who had spiked a neighbour's tea with a laxative over a petty slight, her crime uncovered by a telltale stain on a saucer. The principle was the same, a subtle act, a hidden hand. Here, the hand was cleverer, the stakes higher, but the human nature behind it was familiar. As the wind rattled the windows, Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind alight with possibilities. The past, she knew, held the key, not just Cecilia's, but perhaps Hurst's own. Tomorrow, she would press further, seeking the truth in the shadows of St. Mary's Grange. Chapter 5. The Clue in the Spoon. The third day at St. Mary's Grange dawned with a brittle stillness, the snow outside piling higher against the windows, as if nature itself sought to trap the secrets within. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting neatly folded in her basket, descended to the morning room with a quiet determination. The poisoned death of Dr. Lionel Hurst had cast a pall over the festive season, and the guests, though outwardly composed, moved with the wariness of those who knew a murderer walked among them. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the winter air, was fixed on a single detail: the dessert spoon beside Hurst's plate, its faint discoloration a whisper of the truth she sought. The morning room was subdued, the clatter of teacups and the rustle of newspapers the only sounds. Colonel Bantry, his usual heartiness dampened, sat at the head of the table, while Dolly fussed over the tea-urn, her chatter tinged with nervous energy. Sir Henry Clithering, ever observant, gave Miss Marple a nod, his eyes gleaming with curiosity about her next move. Cecilia Travers, dressed in a sombre yet elegant black gown, sipped her tea with studied grace, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremble. Roger Travers, her stepson, was absent, his empty chair a silent accusation. Miss Violet Henshaw, her notebook tucked under her arm, picked at a scone, her sharp gaze flitting from face to face. Percy Vale, looking more dishevelled than ever, muttered something about the cold and kept his eyes on his plate. Inspector Crane arrived shortly after breakfast, his face drawn from a sleepless night. He announced that the laboratory had confirmed cyanide in Dr. Hurst's system, with traces found in the remnants of his pudding. But, he added, his voice heavy with frustration, the pudding dish itself was clean, as was the brandy sauce. The poison was somehow targeted at Hurst alone. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Miss Marple, her hands folded in her lap, felt a spark of confirmation. The spoon, she thought, was the key. Seizing a moment when Crane was distracted, Miss Marple approached him with her most disarming smile. "Inspector, might I have another look at the dining room? It would ease my mind to see where poor Dr. Hurst met his end." Crane, though sceptical, was too harried to argue with an elderly spinster. "Very well, Miss Marple, but don't touch anything. Escorted by a young constable, she entered the dining room, where the table remained a frozen scene of the fatal night. The air was stale, the candles long since burned out, but the silver cutlery gleamed under the weak daylight filtering through the curtains. Miss Marple's eyes settled on Hurst's place setting. The plate, with its congealed pudding, was cordoned off, but the dessert spoon caught her attention once more. It was identical to the others in design, yet its surface seemed subtly different, less polished, as if it had been handled or cleaned in haste. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and noted a faint, almost imperceptible film on the bowl of the spoon, distinct from the pristine shine of its neighbours. "Constable," she said softly, "was this spoon tested along with the pudding?" The young man blinked, caught off guard. I don't know, miss. The inspector focused on the food, I think." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion growing. "Might you ask him to have it analysed? It may be important." Returning to the morning room, she found Dolly wringing her hands. "Jane, what were you doing in there? You're not meddling, are you?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Just satisfying an old woman's curiosity, Dolly. The dining room tells its own story, if one listens." Dolly sighed, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. If the cyanide had been applied to the spoon, it would explain the singularity of Hurst's death. A thin coating, perhaps a paste or powder, could have dissolved into the pudding as he ate, leaving no trace in the shared dish. Such a method required precision and opportunity, a moment when all eyes were elsewhere. She recalled the dinner, the dimming of the lights as the pudding was brought in, its brandy flames casting a flickering glow. The guests had been distracted, their attention on the spectacle. A deft hand could have tampered with the spoon then, or even earlier, before the plates were set. But who had been near Hurst's place? The butler, Grayson, had presided over the pudding's entrance, while James, the footman, had served the portions. The guests, seated around the table, had all been within reach, though some, Percy Vale, seated closest to Hurst, had better opportunity than others. Miss Marple sought out Sir Henry, finding him in the library, where he was pretending to read a volume of military history. "You've got that look, Miss Marple," he said, closing the book with a grin. "What's caught your eye this time?" She hesitated, then shared her theory about the spoon. "It's possible the cyanide was not in the pudding at all, but on the utensil. A clever trick, don't you think?" Sir Henry's eyebrows rose. "Very clever. And it narrows the field. Someone who could get to the cutlery before or during the meal." He paused, then added, "I saw Vale lingering near the dining room before dinner. Said he was admiring the paintings, but he was awfully close to the table." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Percy Vale's nervous demeanour and chemical business made him a compelling suspect, but she was wary of jumping to conclusions. Cecilia Travers, with her shadowed past, and Roger, with his financial woes, remained equally plausible. Even Miss Henshaw, with her penchant for secrets, could not be dismissed. The key was motive, and Miss Marple needed more to unravel it. She decided to speak with the butler, Grayson, who was overseeing the polishing of silver in the pantry. The man, tall and impeccable despite the strain of the past days, greeted her with polite deference. "Miss Marple, how may I assist you?" She smiled, her tone light. "I was wondering about the cutlery, Mr. Grayson. Were the dessert spoons laid out well before dinner?" He nodded. "Yes, miss. The table was set that afternoon as usual. I inspected it myself," she pressed gently. "And no one touched them after? Not even to adjust a place setting?" Grayson frowned, thinking. "Not that I saw, miss. Though the footman, James, was in and out, and, well, I shouldn't say, but Mr. Vale did wander in before we sat down. He seemed curious about the room." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning to James. The young footman was nervous, perhaps overly so for a mere servant caught in a scandal. She found him in the kitchen, polishing glasses with a distracted air. "James," she said kindly, "you must be dreadfully shaken by all this." He started, nearly dropping a glass. "Oh, miss, it's awful. I served the pudding, and now they think, well, I didn't do anything." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Of course not, dear. But tell me, did you notice anything odd when you set out the spoons, or when you served Dr. Hurst?" James shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, miss. I just cut the pudding and passed the plates. But—" he hesitated, then whispered, "I saw Mr. Vale touch the table near Dr. Hurst's place when the lights went down. I thought he was just steadying himself." The revelation sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. Vale's proximity to Hurst's spoon, combined with his access to chemicals, painted a damning picture. Yet she knew better than to trust the obvious. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a theft by noticing a maid's hesitation over a teacup, a small gesture that led to a larger truth. Here, James's nervousness could be innocence or fear of discovery. She thanked him and returned to the drawing room, where the guests were gathering for a strained luncheon. At the table, Cecilia Travers was subdued, her usual sparkle dimmed. Roger, now present, avoided her gaze, his fork stabbing at his food with unnecessary force. Miss Henshaw, ever watchful, made a pointed remark about hidden truths coming to light, which drew a sharp look from Cecilia. Percy Vale, attempting to lighten the mood, launched into a rambling story about a Christmas past, but his laughter was hollow, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting escape. Miss Marple, eating quietly, observed them all, her mind weaving connections. The spoon, Vale's presence, Cecilia's past, Roger's resentment, each was a thread, but the pattern remained incomplete. After luncheon, Miss Marple slipped back to the dining room, where Inspector Crane was overseeing the collection of evidence. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and respect. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. The spoon's been sent for analysis, as you suggested. We'll see if you're onto something." She smiled, unruffled. "Thank you, Inspector. It's often the small things that matter most." As she left, she caught sight of Roger Travers lingering in the hall, his expression troubled. Had he overheard her conversation with Crane? Or was he simply wrestling with his own demons? In her room that evening, Miss Marple sat by the window, the snow outside glowing under a rising moon. Her notebook lay open, her neat handwriting cataloguing the day's findings, the spoon's discoloration, Vale's proximity, James's nervous confession. She thought of Cecilia's first husband, the chemist, and Hurst's article hinting at poison. Could Cecilia have feared exposure, or was Roger's desperation for his inheritance the driving force? Vale's chemical business loomed large, but Miss Henshaw's knowledge of the Travers family secrets could not be ignored. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was close, hidden in the interplay of these tangled motives. As she closed her notebook, the wind howled, and she felt a quiet certainty. The clue in the spoon would lead her to the killer, if only she could see the final piece. Chapter 6. The Businessman's Secret. The snow had ceased falling by the fourth day at St. Mary's Grange, leaving the estate cocooned in a glittering silence that did little to ease the oppressive air within. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket tucked beside her armchair in the library, felt the weight of the unsolved murder pressing upon the household. The confirmation of cyanide on Dr. Hurst's dessert spoon, reported by Inspector Crane that morning, had sharpened her focus. The poison had not been in the pudding itself, but applied with surgical precision to the utensil, a fact that pointed to a calculated mind and a fleeting opportunity. As she knitted, her needles clicking softly, her thoughts wove through the motives and movements of the guests. each a potential thread in the tapestry of guilt. The library, with its scent of old leather and polished wood, was a refuge from the strained politeness of the drawing room. Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately, knowing that solitude often clarified the mind. The guests, confined by the snow and Crane's orders, were growing restless. Cecilia Travers, her charm wearing thin, had taken to pacing the corridors, her heels clicking like a metronome. Roger Travers, her stepson, kept to himself, his brooding presence a dark cloud. Miss Violet Henshaw, ever the ferret of secrets, was seen whispering with the maids, no doubt fishing for gossip to fuel her book. Percy Vale, meanwhile, had grown increasingly erratic, his jovial facade crumbling under the strain of suspicion. Sir Henry Clithering, the one guest Miss Marple trusted implicitly, had taken to observing the others with a quiet intensity that matched her own. At breakfast, Inspector Crane had shared the laboratory's findings with a grim satisfaction. The spoon was coated with a thin layer of cyanide, likely a paste that dissolved into the pudding, he announced to the assembled guests. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. His eyes swept the room, searching for a telltale flinch, but the guests remained composed, though Percy Vale's hand shook as he reached for his coffee. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted his pallor and the way his gaze darted toward the door. He was a man on edge, and she resolved to probe deeper into his background. She began with Dolly Bantry, whose knack for gossip was as useful as it was unguarded. Finding her friend in the morning room, arranging a vase of holly, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently. "Dolly, dear, you mentioned Mr. Vale's business the other day. Chemicals, wasn't it? Do you know what kind?" Dolly, eager to distract herself, brightened. "Oh, yes, Jane. Arthur says Vale's company supplies all sorts of things. Laboratories, factories, even hospitals. Quite prosperous, or so he claims, though he's been awfully jumpy since this business started. I heard him tell Arthur he'd met Dr. Hurst at some conference, but he didn't seem keen to talk about it." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion growing. A man in the chemical trade would have access to cyanide, and Vale's nervousness suggested more than mere discomfort at being a suspect. Seeking confirmation, Miss Marple approached Sir Henry, who was in the billiard room, idly rolling a cue ball across the green felt. "You've been watching our Mr. Vale, haven't you?" she said, her tone light but pointed. Sir Henry chuckled, setting the cue aside. "You don't miss much, Miss Marple. Vale's a slippery one. I sent a telegram to an old colleague at Scotland Yard this morning, asking about his business. Seems Vale's company is under scrutiny for selling restricted substances, cyanide among them, to unlicensed buyers. Hurst was consulted as an expert witness in the investigation. If Vale knew Hurst was testifying against him, it's motive enough for murder." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Indeed, and a man in his position would know how to apply cyanide to a spoon without drawing attention. Her thoughts turned to the dinner, replaying the moment the lights dimmed for the pudding's entrance. Vale had been seated near Hurst, his hands often in motion as he gestured through his stories. A quick movement, shielded by the darkness, could have coated the spoon, but she needed more than supposition. She recalled James, the footman, mentioning Vale's touch on the table during the pudding's presentation. Was it a clumsy accident or a deliberate act? And what of Cecilia and Roger Travers? Their own motives, tied to Hurst's knowledge of Cecilia's late husband, could not be dismissed. Miss Marple decided to speak with Cecilia, hoping to gauge her reaction to Hurst's past inquiries. She found the widow in the conservatory, surrounded by potted ferns, her expression distant as she gazed at the snow-covered glass. "Mrs. Travers," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle, "I couldn't help overhearing Miss Henshaw's talk of your late husband. It must be distressing to have old rumours stirred up." Cecilia's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing, but she quickly regained her composure. "Miss Henshaw is a busybody," she said coolly. Edmund died of a heart condition, as the coroner ruled. Dr. Hurst's article was mere speculation, nothing more. I barely knew the man. Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers clutched her shawl. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But it's curious, isn't it, how such talk can unsettle people, even someone like your stepson." Cecilia's lips thinned. "Roger is troubled, yes, but he's no murderer. He's simply frustrated by his circumstances." The words were careful, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper fear. Cecilia was protecting herself, or perhaps Roger, from scrutiny. The conversation ended politely, but Miss Marple left with a clearer picture. Cecilia was guarded, her past a potential trigger for violence, and her relationship with Roger was fraught with unspoken tensions. Later, Miss Marple sought out Roger, finding him in the stables, brushing down a horse with more force than necessary. His dark eyes flicked to her, wary but not hostile. "You're asking questions, aren't you?" he said bluntly. "Everyone knows you're poking around." Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. "I only want to understand Mr. Travers. Dr. Hurst's death has upset us all. Did you know him well?" Roger snorted, his brush pausing. "Hardly. He was Cecilia's friend, always sniffing around her business. I heard him at dinner, talking about her first husband, saying he'd dig into it again. Made her furious. Not that I care." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple noted the resentment simmering beneath his words. "It must be difficult," she said softly, "waiting for an inheritance that seems so far off." Roger's hand stilled, his jaw tightening. "I manage," he muttered, turning back to the horse. The pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple needed more. She enlisted Sir Henry's help to dig deeper into Vale's connection to Hurst. Over tea in the library, he shared the latest from his Scotland Yard contact. Vale's company was facing ruin if Hurst's testimony went public, he said. The investigation could have exposed illegal sales, maybe even jailed him. Hurst was set to meet with prosecutors after Christmas. Vale had every reason to want him silenced. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Vale's motive was strong, his access to cyanide undeniable, and his presence near Hurst's spoon damning. Yet Cecilia's fear and Roger's anger lingered as possibilities, as did Miss Henshaw's unsettling knowledge of the Travers family secrets. That evening, as the guests gathered for another tense dinner, Miss Marple watched Vale closely. He was quieter now, his attempts at humour abandoned, his eyes darting to Inspector Crane, who joined them at the table. When the conversation turned to the spoon's analysis, Vale's fork clattered against his plate, drawing a sharp look from Cecilia. Miss Henshaw, seizing the moment, remarked, "It's fascinating how a single utensil can hold such a deadly secret, isn't it? Almost like a chemist's trick." Vale's face reddened, but he said nothing, his silence louder than any protest. In her room that night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She wrote, "Vale, chemicals, motive against Hurst, near spoon. Cecilia, past threatened, guarded. Roger, debts, resentment. Henshaw, knows too much. Spoon coated in cyanide, applied in darkness." She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's wife had poisoned her husband's tea with weed killer, betrayed by a smudge on a cup. The principle here was similar. A small act, a hidden hand. Vale was the likeliest suspect, but Miss Marple's instincts warned her against certainty. The Travers family's secrets and Miss Henshaw's probing could not be ignored. As the fire died down, Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind alight with the challenge. The businessman's secret was a powerful clue, but the truth lay in the interplay of motives, waiting to be unravelled. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would set a trap to catch a killer. Chapter 7. The Christmas Eve. Trap. Christmas morning at St. Mary's Grange should have been a time of joy. with the scent of pine and the promise of gifts filling the air. Instead, the house was shrouded in suspicion, the snow outside a silent jailer keeping the guests bound to their secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting set aside for the moment, felt the weight of the unresolved murder pressing ever closer. The cyanide-coated spoon, Percy Vale's nervous demeanour, and the tangled motives of Cecilia and Roger Travers had brought her near the truth, but a final piece was needed to complete the puzzle. As she sipped her morning tea in the quiet of her room, she resolved to set a trap, one subtle enough to catch a killer without alerting the innocent. The household gathered in the drawing room, where a modest exchange of gifts was attempted to maintain some semblance of festivity. Colonel Bantry, his face lined with strain, handed out cigars and brandy, while Dolly Bantry, ever the optimist, distributed small packages wrapped in festive paper. Cecilia Travers accepted hers with a brittle smile, her elegance undimmed but her eyes wary. Roger Travers slouched in a corner, barely acknowledged the proceedings, his gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Violet Henshaw, clutching a new fountain pen from Dolly, muttered about the irony of celebrating amidst a murder investigation. Percy Vale, his hands unsteady, fumbled with a gift of cufflinks, his laughter forced and hollow. Sir Henry Clithering, accepting a book of poetry, caught Miss Marple's eye, sensing her quiet purpose. Miss Marple had shared her plan with Sir Henry and Inspector Crane before breakfast, choosing her confidants carefully. "I propose we recreate the dinner scene," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "Not the entire meal, but the moment of the pudding's presentation. It may jog a memory or provoke a reaction." Crane, initially sceptical, had warmed to the idea when Sir Henry endorsed it, his Scotland Yard credentials lending weight. "It's unorthodox," Crane admitted, "but we're short on leads. If you think it'll shake something loose, Miss Marple, I'm game." Sir Henry, his eyes twinkling, had added, "I've seen her work miracles with less, Inspector. Let's do it." The recreation was set for the early afternoon, in the dining room where Dr. Hurst had met his end. The table was reset to mirror the fatal night, with the same silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and linen napkins. A mock pudding, prepared by Mrs. Bates under strict supervision, was placed at the centre, its surface glistening with a non-alcoholic glaze to mimic the brandy flames. The guests were instructed to take their original seats, a request that drew murmurs of unease. Cecilia, her lips tight, sat with regal poise. Roger, reluctant, slouched beside her. Miss Henshaw, notebook in hand, watched with hawk-like intensity, and Percy Vale, visibly sweating, took his place near Hurst's empty chair. Colonel and Dolly Bantry, though not suspects, joined to maintain the scene's authenticity, while Sir Henry and Miss Marple positioned themselves to observe. Inspector Crane, standing at the head of the table, explained the purpose. "We're retracing the moment of the crime," he said, his tone authoritative. "Act as you did that night. If you recall anything at all, speak up." The butler, Grayson, entered with the mock pudding, his demeanour as dignified as ever, while James, the footman, followed, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to serve. The lights were dimmed, and a single candle was lit to simulate the brandy flames, casting flickering shadows across the room. Miss Marple, seated at the far end, watched intently. Her trap was simple: to recreate the conditions of the murder and observe the guests' reactions, particularly Vale's. She had noted his proximity to Hurst's spoon, his access to cyanide, and his motive tied to Hurst's testimony. If he betrayed himself under pressure, the truth might surface. As the candlelight danced, she saw Cecilia's hand tighten on her glass, Roger's eyes dart toward his stepmother, and Miss Henshaw's pen pause mid-scribble. But it was Percy Vale who drew her attention. As James cut the pudding and passed the plates, Vale's hand moved briefly toward the table, a subtle gesture that might have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple's breath caught. It was near Hurst's place setting, where the poisoned spoon had lain. "Mr. Vale," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. "You seem quite interested in the cutlery. Were you so attentive on the night Dr. Hurst died?" The room froze. Vale's face drained of colour, his hand jerking back as if burned. I was just adjusting my napkin," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Nothing more." Inspector Crane, alerted by Miss Marple's tone, stepped closer. "You were seen near Dr. Hurst's place that night, sir. Care to explain?" Vale's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. I might have brushed the table, but I didn't do anything." Cecilia Travers spoke up, her voice sharp. "This is absurd, Inspector. Are we to be accused based on every twitch? I was seated across from Dr. Hurst, and I saw nothing." Her defence was swift, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if grateful the focus had shifted. Roger, silent until now, muttered, "Let's not pretend we're all innocent. Hurst was poking into things, family things." His words hung heavy, and Cecilia shot him a look of pure venom. Miss Henshaw, seizing the moment, added, "He's right. Hurst was a meddler. I told you about his article on the Travers family. Someone didn't want that old case reopened." The tension broke when Vale, his composure crumbling, stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Enough!" he shouted. "I can't stand this anymore." Inspector Crane moved swiftly, blocking his path to the door. "Sit down, Mr. Vale," he said, his voice cold. "You've got some explaining to do." Vale sank back into his seat, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to kill him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But Hurst, he was going to ruin me. His testimony would have shut down my business, sent me to prison. I had no choice." The room gasped, but Miss Marple remained still, her eyes fixed on Vale. "And the spoon?" she prompted gently. Vale's shoulders slumped. I coated it with cyanide paste before dinner. Just a thin layer, enough to dissolve into his pudding. The lights were down, and I was close enough to slip it onto his spoon when everyone was watching the flames. I thought it'd look like an accident, or maybe point to Cecilia with her history. Cecilia's face went white, but she said nothing, her hands clenched in her lap. Crane, his notebook open, pressed further. "You had access to cyanide through your company." Vale nodded miserably. "It's used in some of our processes. I took a small amount, thought no one would trace it." He glanced at Cecilia, then away. "I didn't want her involved, but I knew about her husband's case. I thought if suspicion fell on her, I'd be safe." Roger, his voice low, growled, "You tried to frame her?" But Cecilia's silence was telling, her eyes fixed on the table as if seeing something far away. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but clear. "You chose the spoon carefully, didn't you, Mr. Vale? A subtle method, easily overlooked." Vale nodded, defeated. "I knew it'd be quick. Hurst wouldn't suffer, and I'd be clear." Inspector Crane signalled to the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Percy Vale, you're under arrest for the murder of Dr. Lionel Hurst," Crane said, his voice firm. As Vale was led away, the room exhaled, the tension breaking like a snapped thread. Dolly Bantry, tears in her eyes, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was the spoon, Dolly. Its slight tarnish, Vale's nervousness, his access to cyanide, all small things, but they pointed to him. People betray themselves, you know, in the little details." Sir Henry, joining them, chuckled. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard could use you." She shook her head, her eyes twinkling. "I'm just an old woman who notices things, Sir Henry. The pudding, as I suspected, was innocent after all." As the guests dispersed, Cecilia and Roger exchanged a long look, their family secrets safe for now, though Miss Marple sensed their rift would linger. Miss Henshaw, her notebook forgotten, seemed almost disappointed that her theories about the Traverses had not borne fruit. The Grange, freed from the shadow of murder, began to breathe again, though the festive spirit was slow to return. In her room that night, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Vale's confession had tied the threads together. His motive, his opportunity, his subtle act in the candlelight. Yet she felt a quiet satisfaction, not in the tragedy, but in the clarity of truth. Human nature, as she had seen so often in St. Mary Mead, was predictable in its flaws. As she closed her notebook, the snow outside gleamed under the moonlight, and she felt the peace of a puzzle solved. Chapter 8. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The snow had begun to melt as Miss Jane Marple's taxi wound its way back to St. Mary Mead, the tyres crunching softly on the thawing lanes. The turmoil of St. Mary's Grange, with its poisoned spoon and unmasked murderer, seemed to belong to another world, one far removed from the tranquil simplicity of her village. Yet, as she sat in her familiar parlour, the fire crackling in the hearth and her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, Miss Marple knew that human nature was the same everywhere, whether in the grand halls of a country estate or the modest cottages of her home. Her small suitcase, still unpacked, rested by the door, a reminder of the Christmas that had been anything but merry. The parlour was as she had left it, the chintz curtains drawn against the evening chill, the tea tray set with her favourite bone china, and a fresh ball of wool waiting to continue the scarf for her nephew. Outside, the village was settling into its post-Christmas hush, the children's laughter from snowball fights replaced by the soft drip of melting icicles. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, let her mind wander over the events at the Grange, piecing together the final threads of the case that had unravelled so dramatically on Christmas Day. Percy Vale's confession had been the key, his admission of coating Dr. Hurst's spoon with cyanide paste, tying together the clues she had painstakingly gathered. The tarnished spoon, his nervous gestures, his access to chemicals through his business, all had pointed to him, as surely as a signpost. Yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. Vale's motive, rooted in fear of ruin from Hurst's testimony, was a familiar one, echoing the petty greeds and desperations she had seen in St. Mary Mead. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, a village widow who had once tampered with a neighbour's jam out of spite, her crime revealed by a stray crumb. The scale was different, but the impulse was the same, a desperate act to protect one's world. Her thoughts turned to the other guests, now scattered to their lives. Cecilia Travers, her polished exterior intact, had left the Grange with her secrets unspoken, though Miss Marple suspected the rumours about her late husband would linger, like a shadow she could never fully escape. Roger Travers, his resentment undimmed, had parted from his stepmother with barely a word, his debts a chain that would bind him still. Miss Violet Henshaw, disappointed that her theories about the Travers family had not led to the killer, had returned to her manuscript, no doubt weaving the Grange's scandal into her pages. Sir Henry Clithering, ever the gentleman, had promised to visit Miss Marple in St. Mary Mead, his admiration for her insight undimmed. A letter from Sir Henry arrived that afternoon, delivered by the same rosy-cheeked postman who had brought Dolly Bantry's invitation. Miss Marple opened it with a smile, her fingers tracing the familiar crest of his stationery. "My dear Miss Marple," it read, "you have once again proven that the sharpest mind can reside in the most unassuming package. Scotland Yard could learn much from your methods. The Grange is quieter now, though Dolly insists on hosting a New Year's gathering to cleanse the air. I trust you'll be knitting by your fire, but I suspect your thoughts are already on the next puzzle. Yours, Henry." She set the letter aside, her eyes twinkling. He knew her well. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit a candle, its flame casting a warm glow over the parlour. Her notebook, filled with her neat observations from the case, lay closed on the table. She had no need to review it. The details were etched in her memory. The spoon, the dimmed lights, Vale's trembling hands. They had told a story as clear as any village gossip. Yet she felt a familiar stirring, a sense that St. Mary Mead, with its quiet lanes and familiar faces, held its own secrets, waiting to be uncovered. There was Mrs. Price's odd behaviour at the church bazaar, and young Tommy's unexplained absence from choir practice. Small matters, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that small matters often hid larger truths. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and poured another cup of tea. The fire crackled, the village outside lay still, and Miss Marple's mind, ever restless, began to weave a new pattern. The case of the deadly Christmas pudding was closed, but in St. Mary Mead, as in life, there was always another mystery lurking just beneath the surface. With a faint smile, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, and settled in to wait for the next thread to unravel.